Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. We often assume others experience life just as we do. But how do we handle the realization that some people's inner worlds are completely different? For example, imagine being unable to visualize mental images, a condition known as aphantasia, which makes concepts like picturing something in your mind an entirely foreign experience. From how they visualize memories or don't, to how they connect with others, these differences can create misunderstanding, frustration, or even outrage. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer. Our guest today knows this struggle firsthand. Diagnosed with aphantasia and face blindness, they've spent a lifetime discovering how their brain works differently and how that impacts their relationships, creativity, and even emotional resilience. Sadie Dingfelder is a journalist and author whose work explores the complexity of human experience and challenges us to think differently about how we connect with others. Her book, Do I Know You?, is a deeply personal exploration of how our inner worlds shape our realities and our relationships. Let's jump into this fascinating conversation where we'll explore what it means to truly understand and embrace the differences that make us human. So, Sadie Dingfelder, thank you so much for making time to come on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I think this book is really a good fit because, I'm not a scientist and I'm not even a journalist. But I'm sort of trying to become a journalist and trying to become a science journalist. But your expertise is, or your professional background is more the journalism side. But clearly you've looked at a lot of this science and there's a big overlap between a lot of the scientific phenomena we talk about here that drive, these things like polarization and other challenges we have with the outrage industry. And, specifically, I was super excited to sort of hear a little bit about, like you talk about this, the scientists are beginning to look at subjective experience and take it more seriously and sort of ways to either corroborate or disprove what people say about their inner thought processes. So what do you mean by that? Or tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So psychology, when it started out with William James, it was all about introspection. And in fact, he taught his students, and this is like in the 1800s, how to sort of scientifically pay attention to the contents of your own mind. And a lot of people felt like this was not a very scientific way to go. Because there's no way to independently verify what you say. I could tell you right now, like, oh, I'm imagining a dragon eating a lion. Like, that's a lie. Because, but there's no way for you to tell. Actually, there is now, but there didn't used to be. So anyway, that was the beginning. And then in the 50s, psychology really wanted to be taken seriously as a science, actually starting in the 30s. And that's when behaviorism took hold. And we really started focusing on studying things that could be observed directly, specifically behavior. But then, with the advent of fMRI and then in the 90s and I guess it was the late 90s really that it took off, we actually were able to begin to verify or at least corroborate with people's with their descriptions of their inner experiences. And so where this applies to me is that, I cannot visualize. And frankly, it's still hard for me to believe that other people can conjure up like little movies in their minds. But if you do put people in an fMRI machine and you ask most people who say they can visualize, if you throw them in an MRI machine and watch their visual areas light up when they are trying to visualize. So if you ask me to do that and I'm in an fMRI machine, you don't see anything. You see my frontal lobes being like, come on, let's get it together, brain. Let's imagine something. And then nothing happens.
And so what do they think's going on there?
They think that for whatever reason, my frontal lobe is not, so like my whole brain is willing to talk to my frontal lobe, and my frontal lobe is ignored by the more posterior parts of my brain. And actually, when another fMRI study, they found that the connections were pretty sparse between them. And that actually really fits with my personal experience, which is I sort of feel like I'm like a poorly informed White House secretary, you know, like I'm like CJ in the West Wing, and like no one told her what was really going on. And so then in the press conference, like she has to like explain decisions that she was not even in the loop on.
Yeah. Well, before we started, you were talking about, frustrations or just kind of coming to realize that people experience things differently, or, their experiences are that we all have this. So maybe talk a little bit more about that. And I think, is that also basically the phenomenon sort of known as naive reality, I think they call it, or naive realism?
I don't know. I don't know that. I didn't know there was a word for it, but it's cool to know now. But I like to think of, there's like a famous little parable about fish, and it's like you got an old fish, and he sees some youngsters swimming by, and he says, "Hey guys, how's the water?" And the young fish say, "What's water?" Because they don't know. They don't know what water is. It's just their environment, and they have nothing to compare it to. So we're all immersed in our own little bubbles of reality that are constructed by our brains. And it's reasonable to assume that everyone else's reality is pretty much the same as your own. But what I've come to learn is that that is very much not true. And specifically, I've been particularly wrong, because if you're not neurotypical, then what you're assuming is very likely to be incorrect about other people. So I can't visualize. And I also don't do the kind of mental time travel that other people do when they think about their past. Or, like when people are like, what are your regrets in life? Like I could try to work one out, but I don't have anything that comes instantly to mind. Whereas I think a lot of people can almost time travel back to the pivotal moments in their life. And so, for instance, one of my best friends actually is a hyper visualizer. Her name's Miriam, and she can imagine. She can like relive every important moment from her life anytime she wants. Sometimes it's not at all even intentional. So anyway, she takes forever to get over breakups, like forever. And I always thought that she was like choosing to wallow in the past, but actually that's just the way her reality works. Whereas for me, my memory of that person is going to fade really fast, and I'm going to lose I'm not going to feel that sad about it for very long.
Yeah. And I think, sort of tying it back, sort of starting to tie it back to some of the ways some of the things we talk about on the show about outrage, and maybe helping being less stressed out about it. I mean, this seems like sort of building that understanding really helped you. I mean, that requires incredible empathy to figure out how to even do that. Since you can't visualize, you have to sort of visualize that people are visualizing in the abstract almost, right?
Yeah. It's so hard for me to believe everyone, but the fMRI shows it. People are visualizing, and in fact it makes sense. And because people like my dad, for instance, can or my mom, like people can imagine how to decorate their house, and like I certainly can't. And whenever people were like, oh, wouldn't that rug look nice in your living room, I was like, no, I have no freaking idea. Like, how would anyone know until you buy it and put it in the living room? So it's like one of these things that I guess I kind of feel a little silly not having figured it out before now, but it's a mistake everyone makes. Even if you're neurotypical, no one's really living in the exact same reality unless you have like an identical twin or like a
And even then, I think they talk about how there's I don't know if that's actually even goes
no,
that
they
far.
are different. Yeah, you're right. Of course, even identical twins live in slightly different bubbles.
Well, and there's this idea of sort of social epistemology where our social networks also influence how we learn things and how we come to know things, and that so it's experience playing into it as well as whatever the biology is, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Temple Grandin sort of talks about all these different kind of learners and thinkers, and I don't know if all of her theories have been sort of fleshed out, but I mean, there's certainly a lot to it. Kind of the visual learners and the math, different kinds of people do it different ways. And, she sees herself in a certain way of how her skill set can apply to sort of problem solving.
Yeah.
And you sort of talk about that a little bit too, that these different people are sort of looking at the world with inner monologue or not, or visualizing or not. But all kind of thinking the other person is doing the same thing.
And like, it's kind of, it's really, it's like, obviously I had read Temple Grandin's book before, and I almost just thought, the problem is language. Let me just blame language, because when people would say things where do you see yourself in the future? I would assume that they meant it metaphorically, but some people don't actually mean it metaphorically. And to find out, you have to start asking really granular questions. Another example is that, counting sheep, like to go to sleep, or imagining an audience naked. All of these things can really easily be interpreted metaphorically. Like I will look at an audience and imagine and look and think as if they were naked, and so the problem is that with language, we all just automatically link it up to our own experiences. And so we don't really have the moment of trying to figure out what people mean when they say something, what they mean specifically.
Right. There's just assumption after assumption after assumption.
When we have to do that, otherwise you would never
Right.
be able to get anything done. But if you have the time, this is what I've discovered, is that even if you meet someone who might seem to be a little boring, if you start asking them what their inner life is like from moment to moment, it can be super interesting. Like, not only is the question like, can you relive moments from your past? Sort of, most people can do it sort of visually, but some people really feel fully immersed in the scenes, and other people sort of see things from a third person perspective, which I think is so interesting, because that's obviously not just replaying. We know in neuroscience that you reconstruct a memory every time you access it, but the fact that people can actually end up with like a third person perspective, I think is super fascinating.
Yeah, and that kind of takes me to your book. You talk about wonder and awe a lot, and when we spoke before, you talked about that as kind of an antidote to outrage. Maybe tell us a little bit how maybe we can cultivate that sense of wonder and sort of take wonder in the human diversity out there, and maybe use that to kind of foster understanding.
Yeah, it is, I'm like, let's talk about a concrete example. My neighbors across the street believe in aliens, and they show me pictures that they think are proof of aliens. And sometimes I am narrow-minded. I mean, I don't believe in aliens, but sometimes I'm narrow-minded about them, and I'm like, oh, they're dumb or something like that. But actually, the fact that other people's brains are more prone to seeing magic and are maybe more creative than my brain, and just not, I'm a very linear thinker, and when I talk to very lateral thinkers, sometimes it can be frustrating, but it's also sort of astonishing, the really interesting connections that other types of brains can make. And I do think that we're at a moment in human history where we need neurodiversity. We need all these different types of brains on deck. And so, I wouldn't put the guys across the street in charge of like a contacting aliens program or something, but they're probably great at other sorts of things that do require leaps in logic that might also lead them astray sometimes. So we need all brains on deck. And I'm a big fan of neurodiversity, even though it does lead to a lot of confusion and miscommunication.
Yeah. So I guess I'm fascinated by the idea of like how face blindness works. So like, do you like have to sort of create sort of systems or tricks to sort of like, oh, when I see that person again, I will know them somehow by finding other things you can connect to them, or does it just like maybe the voice or other things?
So, I mean, it's really interesting. Face blindness, it's really like I kind of want people to reframe it and think about like I see faces as well as like a monkey. Like I can remember faces like as well as a below average macaque, according to one researcher. That's actually better than most animals. But the thing is, humans are face masterminds. You guys have, I'm saying you guys, but neurotypical humans, you guys have like a whole chunk of brain. It's the size of an almond or an olive, that two chunks, one on either hemisphere, that make you almost like a photographic memory for faces and not for any other type of thing. Like if I was like, hey dude, look at this cool rock, and then like 20 minutes later, I'm like, pick this rock out of this pile of rocks. Like you would not be able to do that with a rock, but you could definitely do it with a face. And so, so I guess that my point is that like in terms of like me moving through the world as a face blind person, I actually did not realize how much better everyone else was than me. So my whole life I thought I was just a little below average at face recognition. And by the way, I get emails from people all the time that always say, oh, I'm not as bad as you, I'm a little below average. And I have to say a lot of those people are probably as bad as me, but we've all got tricks that we just learned. But anyway, yeah, so I actually am so much worse than I realized I was. Like I didn't know that I was face blind. I really didn't until I signed up for this Harvard study, and they told me. And even after they told me, I kept on, some part of me was always like, but not really, like it really, really took a long time for me to accept how bad I am at faces. And I'm still astonished on a regular basis how much better everyone else is.
Well, yeah, it's like I was saying. It's like you can only sort of imagine it in the abstract, which seems like it would be always be like a lifelong challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And the thing is like in terms of concrete examples though, like what I've noticed is that other people can talk to someone at a party and then like go do something else and then see that same person 20 minutes later and they will remember that person. Whereas I will be like, have we met? And they're like, yeah, we have. Like but the thing is like, it's not like I forgot our conversation. If you're like, oh, we were just talking about birds, I'd be like, oh yeah,
So, building on your experience with all these diagnoses and just learning about some of these things throughout your life, I mean, how do you think that plays maybe, how can we kind of encourage critical thinking and information literacy skills? Does it play into that in some way?
Oh, literacy skills, critical thinking. I think that what I would like for everyone who reads my book to do is because so the title of my book is "Do I Know You?" like question mark, but it's not just me not recognizing people. It's actually people not knowing. It's like, do I know you? Like question, like my husband, like my best friend, my boss. Like there's all these people in your life that you think you know, but do you really? Like, and I bet that you've never really asked them. Like I didn't realize my husband can visualize, right? Like my own husband, I had no idea that he could do that. He's a good chess player. I might have been able to infer it, but um, yeah. So asking people what their inner lives are like and believing them and taking it seriously is just a great first step, I think, to developing this sort of sense of curiosity that can help to counteract feelings of frustration and outrage when we don't see eye to eye with other people.
What's an example? Like, what's a question you might ask?
Oh, a great question is just like, do you have an inner monologue? And then, and a lot of people will be like, yeah, obviously. And then I'm like, I don't have one. Like, and that's why I have always found it very difficult. People are like, hey, Sadie, can you think before your talk? And I'm like, I don't even know what you mean with that. So like, if someone, so anyway, so asking people about their inner monologues is really interesting. Some people, again, my friend Miriam has such a complex and busy inner life, and it has really made me um understanding of how she's always late everywhere and like seems a little scattered, because my brain is so quiet and peaceful and focused, whereas she's got, so you can ask people like, what is your inner monologue like? And people like Miriam have several threads going at the same time. They have like meta commentary on the, basic like level, or they have dialogue between themselves and some imagined other person, and then like, and then judgments on top of that. And yeah, so just asking people what their inner life is like, I think is a really interesting exercise. And if people are like, what are you talking about? You can be like, the basic things that most people experience are, inner hearing or inner speaking. And also some like feeling feelings, which I think is really interesting, because I do not experience feelings directly. I usually have to infer it from my body. So I'll be like, oh, like I'm crying, I must be upset. Like that's how I find out I'm upset. Whereas other people feel it, like they'll feel anger in their chest, or they'll feel worry in their stomach. And, it's just, I don't know. It's just so interesting how many ways there are to be conscious, to be a conscious human.
It's interesting that you say that you have this, you decide that you realize that you're upset because you're crying.
Yeah.
Rather than the other way around. And that's interesting there, because I've seen some research talking about how, our body, that works that way even for, neurotypical people, let's say, because in some sense, at least at some microsecond or millisecond level, where the body reacts before, and then the brain like responds to that, almost like a biofeedback loop that you don't even know is happening because it's so fast.
Yeah.
And so did the emotion trigger it, or did the crying trigger it? And there's questions about that.
There is, but I'm reading this really good book right now by Sergio Pellis, I think. And it's all about effective neuroscience. And, obviously before you start crying, your limbic system, this sort of deeply embedded, very old part of your brain, is what makes you cry, right? So it does start in your brain, but it doesn't start at the conscious part of your brain. So basically my limbic system is like, we're going to cry. And then my eyes start crying. And then my prefrontal cortex notices and is like, oh, look, we're upset, and puts it all together. But really, yeah. So anyway, yeah, our brains, even neurotypical people's brains, really consist of like different parts that are in conversation and competition with each other, and just trying to figure things out.
Right. Yeah, it definitely is. And much of it is happening without our conscious awareness of it. Right. I mean, and
yeah.
I was going to ask about that too, because you talked a little bit about, that you sort of don't have an inner monologue, but there's a lot of, science and neuroscience talking about sort of this inner narrator part of our brain,
yeah,
that sort of rationalizes stuff that we do, that we kind of either already decided to do. And there's a lot of talk about whether that's where free will either does or does not come in. So do you feel like, or have you studied the science to say, well, you still have that inner narrator, or do you think you don't have that inner narrator?
I think that I have whatever is the basis of that inner narrator, but it just does not poke up above the level of conscious thought for me. So for whatever reason, everyone's conscious brains are like a very busy executive, and like, so the rest of the brain is only feeding forward the most important information. And for whatever reason, my busy executive or the underlings have decided that really like nothing gets through.
There's a bunch of stuff being filtered out.
Right.
Well, I mean, it must think something else is more important, so I'm going to focus on that.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, so, a lot of times when people have a limitation here, it's a benefit there. Do you feel that way as well? Like these traits have made you better at thing A, B, C?
Yeah. So I, yes. And you know, what really made me realize it was talking to Craig Venter. He is the, if you remember, or if you don't remember, he was like the Time Man of the Year in 2000 because he led the team that beat the federal government, the NIH, in sequencing the human genome. So he's like a very famous, very brilliant scientist. And I'm not saying I'm anything like him, but just basically people who have aphantasia, which is an inability to visualize, do tend to be big picture thinkers. So we are good at abstraction, and that we do tend to be in STEM fields more than you would expect a chance. Though there are lots of people with aphantasia who are artists. So I don't think it doesn't like rule out any careers for you, but you do have a little advantage when it comes to abstraction because you are encoding information with words instead of images.
Okay. Yeah. So, I have not really heard of this loving kindness meditation before. Is that, what's that about? And has that helped you approach sort of the political and other social outrage?
Yes. Oh, okay. It's called loving kindness, which sounds loopy. It's also known as metta, METTA. And what it's all about is you start by trying to show yourself compassion. Oh, actually, you start with something really easy, like a puppy or a child that you already love. And obviously, I can't do it the visualizing way. Normally, they tell you to visualize that person. I can't do it. So I actually have to pull up a picture of that person or pet, or sometimes the pet's just on my lap. And it's very easy usually to conjure up feelings of love towards that animal. And then once you have that feeling going, you try to extend it to yourself, which is surprisingly difficult. And then you try to extend it to someone that is just part of your life that you don't feel any which way about. And then you try to extend it to someone who drives you crazy, And so that, I mean, if you were a very accomplished meta practitioner, you could do that to someone, on the political side of the aisle that you absolutely abhor. If you can sort of, because the point of the whole exercise is to realize that at the end of the day, we're all beings that want to be safe and want to be heard and loved and cared for. And we just have some very basic things in common. And so it's just like trying to cultivate that practice of compassion.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Well, Sadie, and the book is Do I Know You? And should be out soon if it's not already out by the time this episode airs. So Sadie Dingfelder, thank you so much for making time to come on our show.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, it's so fun to meet you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Good talking with you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.